Welcome to Nothing Is Real, podcast about the Beatles. My name is Jason Carty.
My name's Stephen Cockcroft.
And we're live on tape from Dublin and Belfast. This is the second part of our look at the Beatles at Christmas in the 1970s. And in our first part, we went from 1970 to 1973. And in the interim, we've advised that we have a sister episode covering all of 1974, which will fill in all the 365 days from Christmas 73 to Christmas 74. And so this week, we're going to look at 1974 right up to the end of the decade. And without repeating ourselves, it's worth looking at some of the things that we mentioned in the 1974 episode that happened at Christmas, you know. So Paul has Band on the Run out, and that's become a huge success. It comes out at the end of 73, and by the end of 74, it is the Band on the Run that we all know and love, basically.
This is him becoming Rock Paul.
Yes, him becoming Rock Paul. And it's interesting because the first couple of Paul albums, they weren't not successful. It wasn't like they didn't go into the top 10 or they didn't go to number one.
No,
but there is
or that he didn't have number one singles and
yeah. But Band on the Run became a different thing. It hung around for the year.
It did, and it had a slow start. You know, we mentioned this. It was released right at the tail end of 73, and it didn't sort of race up the charts. It was definitely a slow build, but it really does mark that transition from where Paul is sort of struggling slightly to establish his solo career to suddenly he's king of the hill.
And Ringo, at the end of 74, has put out Goodnight Vienna, and he's riding on the coattails of the massive success of the Ringo album, again, something we've talked about before. And Goodnight Vienna has its moments and it has its hits, but it is the start of this kind of diminishing returns kind of Ringo-ism.
Well, yes, it's slightly less, I suppose, coherent or less accomplished than Ringo. John is there, but, George is absent. For reasons that we discussed in the 1974 episode. But he's still, Only You is the single. It's a big hit. Your favorite Ringo song, the No song?
No.
is there. So he's still doing well. But he will from this point on have a diminishing return. But 19th of December, he makes his promo for Only You. Appears on Top of the Pops, and that's those sort of Harry Nilsson.
Yes,
those are some really odd promos he did for that album and single.
And then John is in full tilt mode. He's got Walls and Bridges out. He's in promo mode. In December, he appears on Monday Night Football. He's doing all these radio appearances. And again, as we mentioned in the 1974 episode, December the 27th is the day where in Disney World in the Hawaiian Village Hotel, he signs the papers that makes the Beatles history. This is the true legal split of the Beatles.
This is and they all know this coming up to the end of 74. They all know this is the sort of the legal dissolution, and we've already had that meeting. And
and the other three have already signed up to this dissolution.
And but interestingly, in those promo appearances, John is still being asked, well, will the Beatles get back together? And he's being, this is one of those periods where he's being reasonably positive, saying, you never know. It's always in the wind. It's always in the wind. But again, a bit like Paul, like all of them, I suppose, you get asked that question and you respond to it in the context of whatever you're promoting at the time. And he's Number 9 Dream is a single in the charts at that particular time. So, you got product to sell.
Yeah, he's not going to be all negative about it.
No.
On the BBC at Christmas time, covering their, continuing their Beatles at Christmas on the BBC, they show the movie Help, which maybe that's the time you saw it instead of 72.
Well, I would have been
11, a bit older,
10 or 11 in that
in old money.
In old money,
that would have been an impactful age. But the thing we didn't talk about in our 1974 episode, which we're going to pull up the chairs now and chat about for an hour or two, is our friend George, who decides he's going to throw his hat into the ring of Christmas singles, and he releases the song Ding Dong. Not a tribute to Terry Thomas, and instead it's not a very good Christmas song, really.
Do you not hear this every Christmas in supermarkets and elevators across the world?
Well, you don't, and
you would in my house.
In your supermarket.
No, you wouldn't. You wouldn't hear it in my supermarket.
But it is definitely the poor relation of Happy Christmas, War's Over and Wonderful Christmas Time, and many people wouldn't even know that George has it. It doesn't even creep onto those kind of esoteric Christmas radio shows or anything like that. It's really disappeared in a way.
It's a very odd song.
Yes.
Arguably, it's a year late
Hmm.
in terms of its sound. It has a distinctly UK glam rock
Hmm.
uh, sound, and it's got a slightly Phil Spector sound. It's a big wall of sound production.
Yeah.
It doesn't really sound like anything else that's in George's canon, and arguably it doesn't really sound like anything else on the Dark Horse album.
But it is a curio because George quite explicitly himself would have said he wasn't chasing commercial trends particularly.
No.
And yet here he is with the notion that, he believes in his mind he has written an all-conquering Christmas single. I think Ringo is drumming on it, if I'm right, is he?
Yes, Ringo's drumming.
And not only does he, approach this thinking it's a big commercial success, for a guy who has been very explicit about "Hear Me, Lord" and spiritualism, to kind of do something on the commercial side of Christmas isn't really in keeping with them either.
No, I think that's right. I mean, one of the things that I think characterizes his career after All Things Must Pass is there is a sort of lack of ambition in
Mm,
this, not sort of artistic ambition necessarily, but certainly not that commercial chasing of a number one hit.
yeah,
Um, but here he is setting out to write something that is explicitly aimed at becoming a perennial Christmas favorite. He's adopting the sort of you couldn't say that he is in any way associated with glam rock.
yeah.
Ringo dabbled in that a little bit with Back Off Boogaloo. He's hanging out with Mark Bolan. You don't have any sense of that with
But the other
George.
context of this is, and it's very much a sort of a British type of context, is the notion of the Christmas number one and the Christmas single. And 1973 had been this high watermark in the British charts where Slade had "Merry Christmas Everybody" at
Mm.
number one, and Wizard, good old Roy Wood, had "I Wish It Could Be Christmas Every Day" out in 73. And George is releasing Ding Dong into that realm where he thinks he's going to hit these big British Christmas hit singles. And again, it doesn't happen. It doesn't even make the top 10 or 20.
No, I mean it's a hit elsewhere in the world, but it certainly doesn't really set the charts alight in the US or the UK.
Yeah.
Um, there,
And
there's
yeah.
I was just going to say, but Simon Lang in his book does record the fact that George was absolutely convinced that
Yeah.
he'd written a surefire hit, and that he was going all out to get that hit, and maybe it was a kind of uh, riposte to Happy Christmas,
War's over.
War is over.
Well, it's apparently inspired by a wall carving. Frankie Crisp, who we have talked about before on this show, the previous owner of Friar Park, had all these carvings and aphorisms in his house, and so the Ding Dong opening line was carved around a fireplace. Is that right?
Yes, George seems to spend a lot of time at that fireplace writing songs. Um,
Looking at the wall for inspiration,
Looking at the wall
literally.
for yeah, literally. So yes, it's that ring out the old, ring in the new. And he has said in an interview that that he'd spent a couple of years sitting in front of that fireplace before he realized, that's a song. Um, how right he wasn't, and
Yes.
but again, it's one of the we talked before about the fact that when George writes a song, writes a lyric, it can very often be looked at in different ways. If he writes a love song, is it a song to Patty? Is it a song to God? Is it a spiritual song or whatever? And again, there's a lot going on in the lyric for a very slight lyric.
Yeah.
So is this a song of just a simple, ring out the old, ring in the new? It's Christmas, New Year. Is this a sort of a saying goodbye to the Beatles, which he
Yep.
knows is coming legally to an end in at the end of that year.
Yep.
Um, Also, at this time, his marriage to Patty is effectively over,
Yes.
and perhaps it's a sort of goodbye to that as well. So it sort of operates on a couple of different levels, or at least you can interpret it.
Yeah, and he is someone who believed in sort of a shedding of the skin or transitioning of
Yeah,
form and all the rest. So he does believe in all that. The promotional push for this is remarkable because he makes this very interesting, intricate video. So this is before a good year before your Bohemian Rhapsody as being the first video. He does this. It's not just a straightforward performance video. There's costumes, there's gags, there's jokes.
yeah.
And again, it's based all in Friar Park.
It is. So he's living effectively in a giant movie set, and he makes the most of it. So and it's a fantastic video in the sense that again there's a lot to unravel or a lot to unpick.
Yeah.
Um, so it runs through a nice chronology of the Beatles. So he's dressed up in his Hamburg leathers with his very long hair greased back. It looks terrible. And then he appears in the collarless jackets. He appears in Sergeant Pepper outfit. At one point, he appears to be naked,
Yes.
but holding an acoustic guitar, and Lang in particular comments that this seems to be a bit of a poke or a jibe at John and Yoko and the Two Virgins cover, which is
Yeah.
again,
Hmm.
so there's all of that sort of unfolding, and you have dancing gnomes in the background, and dancing girls, and Indian musicians, and it's slightly Python-esque.
It is Python-esque, and he is enthralled to Monty Python at the time. He's wandering around the gardens of Friar Park in the video, pointing at things with a fake hand and all that
Yes,
kind of stuff. Uh,
that's what you would do
that's
yourself
what
if
you would
you.
do. So it's an unusual way for him to end 1974 after this big tour and all the rest, to put
Yeah,
out this song that then doesn't deliver. And I don't know, does he ever talk about it in
I
following years? I don't recall any
I
particular.
I don't recall. It seems to be one of those things that is just sort of confined to
Yeah,
the video. I think is in the Apple Years box set, and
yeah,
the video ends with a pirate flag.
yeah. There's some symbolism to that,
There
isn't there?
really there seems to be there's a pirate flag flying over Friar Park, and the video ends with him removing the flag and putting up the sort of yellow and red symbol flag, and again, supposedly, Paddy Boyd at one point had run the skull and crossbones up the flagpole to signify her annoyance with something he was doing, or that she was fed up with the relationship. I think that must be how it works. If you're planning a divorce,
That
you just
yes, that's it. You put the Jolly Roger up, and
yeah. I mean,
that's
divorce law is not my field, but this must be something. And of course, you're tempted to think of George's obsession with pirates, which we'll come on to. But
yes.
and interesting, Ron Wood plays on this song as well, and of course, Ron famously involved in a sort of triangle or a quadrangle of some
Yes,
description with Paddy
involved
Boyd,
in
and
exploring the boundaries of marriage.
that's my lord, yes,
Yes. So that's 1974. And then you go into 1975. And in terms of general Beatleness, we can see that Apple is profitable. They have a turnover of 2.5 million and they have £260,000 in profit for 1975. That's pretty good.
that's not bad.
Um, the Beatles kind of retro aspect of their career is starting because there's a 2-day Beatle movie festival in New York City across Christmas 1975. And then, as you say, sticking with George, first of all, he does keep up the pirate theme because this is the Christmas where he does what we the pirate Bob stuff from Rutland Weekend Television, which we mentioned in All Things Must Pass. But that's still a funny thing.
It is hilarious,
It
and
is funny.
the entire episode is available on YouTube, and it's worthwhile. People sort of go and look at his performance at the end, musical performance, but it's actually worth watching the entire uh, episode. It's a Christmas episode. It includes, skiing in your own home as one of the sort of videos, or Santa doesn't live here anymore, and George keeps popping up with Neil Innes and sort of bemoaning Eric Idle's refusal to let him
Be a
appear in
pirate.
be a pirate.
Rutland Weekend Television. I mean, obviously, its legacy is that we know of it today is because it gave us the Ruttles. But
Yeah,
it is amazing in the 21st century that it is unavailable anywhere, and that's because of Eric Idle has not allowed it to come out on video, come out on DVD. That it's locked down, and
do
he never totally been clear. I think about why that
I was
is.
going to say, do we know why? Because I mean, it's hilariously funny.
It is
Uh,
hilariously funny. It is, though, when the show was made, and we're going off into Monty Python podcast territory here. Eric Idle made it on his own with Neil Innes from the Bonzos and who contributed to the Ruttles, of course. But it was made on a very thin budget. It doesn't have an audience. It's not. It was literally made on the cheap. I don't think it necessarily looks cheap, but it doesn't have the production values of an episode of Monty Python.
no, but
And
they sort of made a virtue of that by this
yes,
is
they did.
One Weekend, the smallest county in England. This is the smallest television station in England, and
Yeah, so it's supposed to be kind of naff.
yeah, it's almost literally made in a broom cupboard in the
Yeah.
BBC, and it seems to have been recorded very quickly. So this episode was recorded on the 13th of December, and it aired on Boxing Day. So I mean, that's a very fast turnaround.
Yeah, and considering Monty Python have, even in their recent Blu-ray reissues in the last 12 months, they've put out all the stuff we never thought we'd see, like their training videos that they made for
Yeah,
cash in the early 70s. You think Rutland Weekend Television should come out. So please, Eric Idle, get it together.
yeah. We'll,
Although,
we'll we'll drop him a note and see if
yeah,
he want to explain.
he's amusingly narky on Twitter, Eric Idle. Um, but let's look at the rest of the Beatles. Ringo, he puts out the Blast from Your Past album, which, again, it's this diminishing returns, maybe an admission of defeat that, well, I've done my solo thing, and here's my greatest hits.
Well, it's Blast from Your Past, is always a bit of a curio to me. I mean, with the exception of Paul, who sticks with Capital.
Yes.
The other three put out, well, or have put out for them, best of albums. So, John, 1975, you've got Shaved Fish. Ringo does this, and then there's a best of George Harrison will follow. But this is the last album to be released on the Apple label,
Okay.
or at least the last Beatles album
Until the reissues
until
and
the sort of revival in the
yeah.
90s. But the statistics here are impressive. It features 8 singles, 1 B-side, and 1 album track, all released in the preceding 5 years, and all 8 of those singles charted in the US, and all of them except Buku of Blues made the top 10. Photograph and Your 16 both hit number 1.
So it's a
So
proper greatest hits. You can't deny it.
no, it is a proper greatest hits, and it was the only place that you could hear, or only album where you could hear "It Don't Come Easy," "Back Off Boogaloo," early 1970. For all that, it's quite short. I mean, it's about 30 minutes long. I know that's your favorite
That's
length
my
of
favorite length of album, yeah.
album. Um, so it is a bit of a sort of a rounding up, and an end to his career with EMI or Apple, but it really does badly in the charts. I mean, it does not chart in the UK, and
Yeah.
it peaks at number 30 in the US. Whereas you think any album that contained 2 number 1 singles and a total of 8 top 10 singles, but would be a sell. And I think it must have been a bit of a shock to Ringo
Yeah.
that this didn't. Maybe it was too soon after Good Night Vienna and
It might have
Ringo.
been too soon, but again, I do love the Ringo album, but I think there's a significant amount of people who, once they owned it, was like, well, this is all I need.
Yeah.
And, even I feel that way. I don't have every single Ringo album by any stretch of the imagination. Does that get me kicked off the podcast?
Yeah, we're going to have to get somebody else in to do the 4-episode troll through Sentimental Journey.
But Ringo also, that's the Christmas at the end of 75, he moves off to Monte Carlo for, I'm sure there's fiscal reasons for that as well.
Oh,
But
yeah, for tax reasons, I think, well, hopefully this time next year, you and I will be broadcasting live from Monte Carlo.
Christmas at Monte Carlo don't they have this club down on the seafront?
We
But
do,
before he goes off to Monte Carlo, he goes to see Queen.
not the Queen.
Not the Queen, but the band Queen. And I quite like the notion that, in fair play to Ringo, he's hanging out with Mark Bolan. He's keeping his ear to the ground of some of the contemporary
Yeah.
pop trends. And he goes off these are the Christmas 75 gigs that Queen do in Hammersmith Odeon that are kind of, there's a live album of them now. They've kind of gone down in history.
Yeah, these are kind of legendary performances, But yeah, he's, I wonder, was he there with, Harry Nilsson, Keith Moon, they all
The usual crew.
hanging out, all the usual crew. But yeah, Ringo is still, with Elton John, and these all seem like old-fashioned artists now, but these were kind of relatively cutting edge and
Yep.
contemporary. So yeah, he's keeping up with what's
And
going down.
yeah, and Queen are the Christmas number 1 in the UK with Bohemian Rhapsody. So it is the kind of their breakthrough moment where they go from being early Queen to world conquering Queen. So that's interesting. Perhaps the person with the most transformed Christmas is John Lennon, because by Christmas 1975, he's become a father for the second time. And so what didn't seem possible or likely at Christmas 74, where he was still separated from Yoko. He is back together with Yoko. Sean has been born in October 75. On December the 11th, his friend Bob Gruen, the photographer, takes the kind of well-known photos of John in the Dakota with his hair all swept back in a ponytail, holding up baby Sean.
Yeah.
The ones that most fans would know. They're certainly being reproduced in the current John reissues of Give Me Some Truth and all the rest. So all these baby Sean pics are taken when he's just 2 months old, and he's certainly not on a promotional treadmill, or he's not releasing any records in December 75, nor is it going to happen for the future.
No, by this stage, he's clearly shelved any plans. I mean, it's well known that after Walls and Bridges, there were plans afoot to record the follow up, which is supposedly going to be called Between the Lines. I think was the scheduled
Okay.
title. Um,
That sounds like a gritty BBC One cop drama.
he oh, that would have been good promotional activity
Yeah, with
to,
Trevor Eve.
to write the theme tune for that. But he sort of has shelved that. There are demos kicking around from there. This is the songs like Tennessee and that type of thing. Popcorn, some poppy little song. But yeah, he's absolutely now just done a 180 degrees on that, and he's sitting in bed. It's very odd photographs of him sitting in bed. You're kind of surrounded by the radio and newspapers, and it's all very it doesn't look very glamorous, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say, as a
No,
rock star life. But
but certainly, as is well documented, the birth of Sean flipped a certain kind of switch
yeah,
in John, and he was quite proud and happy to be a father at that time. So he's relaxing at home. He's very much based. He's back in New York. He's based in the Dakota, and it's Christmas week, and he's got a tiny baby. Maybe you're trying to get that baby to sleep, and there's a knock on the door. And you're like, who the hell is knocking on my door? Particularly since I live in an apartment block many
yes,
stories up.
with
This is
security,
strange. You think
So
security would have stopped that. And, through the door, he probably hears the faint lull of carol singers. And he opens the door. And who are the carol singers, Stephen?
it's Paul and Linda.
Paul and Linda are at the door of the Dakota Christmas week singing carols to John Lennon, making one of his spontaneous decisions to drop in on John and Yoko.
Yeah,
And in fairness, they do spend the evening together, and they chat. And the photographer Bob Gruen is there, and frustratingly, he must not have had his camera with him, or he must have been told not to document what was going on.
and do you think Paul had turned up with a Christmas gift of frankincense and myrrh and dynamite weed?
He might have had some dynamite weed. That was his want. But it is kind of sweet that they were hanging out at that time. And one of the said it would have been lovely to have photographic evidence
Yeah,
from that time. And this is Christmas '75, where Saturday Night Live had already started, and there's this notion that Paul used to go over and hang out at John's, and there's the whole night he went over and Saturday Night Live was on and all the rest. Um, but the other thing that's kind of a nice thought is that at this point you'd kind of think, well, Paul must have met Sean Lennon, which is a
yes,
really sweet notion.
yes. I've never heard him mention that.
Yeah,
I mean,
well,
he talks about calling it the Dakota, but I've never heard him specifically say. But
yeah, he interacted with baby Sean,
yeah,
and he's a fan of babies, hiding them in his jacket and all the rest. He's
Uncle Paul.
Uncle Paul, let him in. Maybe that's what the song's about. But yeah, that so Paul and Linda are hanging around the Dakota Christmas week with John Yoko and Bob Gruen, and it's all, if we're looking at these Christmases snapshots year on year, it's very different. Christmas '75 to Christmas '70 and '71, where they're at each other's throats and trying to
Yeah.
figure out what's going on.
And I suppose Paul, maybe, John would have been able to console Paul that his latest single hadn't really set the charts alight.
Well, Venus and Mars was the single, and even though the album is a hit, and he's in the middle of his Wings Over the World trek of '75, '76, Venus and Mars, the single, doesn't actually chart, which is odd at Christmas time.
No, so it doesn't chart in the UK. It does. It kind of charts in America. It gets to number 12, but it's an odd choice for a single, because it's that Venus and Mars slash rock show, and it's a
Yes.
it's a peculiar edit of
Yeah, the single edit is odd, and I think it works great as the kind of double-headed album opener,
yeah,
and it works well on Wings Over America. But it's a bit of an odd single to groove to.
yeah. It's not very Christmassy.
Yeah, it's a bit twinkly in the skies, isn't it? No, no, okay.
It's no ding dong.
It is no ding dong. Thank God for that. So that's Christmas '75. All of them again in a different place. What we kind of notice now for the rest of the decade is there's a bit of a pattern that's going to emerge where Paul is the guy who's keeping himself busy, and the other three are maybe slightly less busy or less focused on Christmas based activities. But let's see how that pans out. In Christmas 76, from a Beatles point of view, Alexandra Palace in London has the first UK Beatles convention on December the 18th and 19th. And Ali Pali is a big venue, but this is not a success because only a few hundred people are there. But one of them, tellingly, is Mark Lewison.
Yes, and Mark talked a little bit about this on the episodes he did for us in season one, and yeah, I mean, you think now if you held that kind of convention, how many people would turn up? But
Well, in 2020, none, but I know what you mean.
obviously none this year, but
Rules are rules.
those are rules. But yes, the organizer, Dave Chisnell, is that how you pronounce that? He was actually offered the Roundhouse in London as a venue, and he turned it down because he thought it would be too small.
Oh, gosh.
And he said at the time, "I'm disappointed that a lot more fans didn't turn up, but I think we did quite well considering the weather, which was miserable." You've got to remember this is the first major Beatles convention. I'm not sure major is the right word there, and I think people have got to get used to the idea of having them. You've got to
Well,
get used to having these.
that is kind of foresighted. And, we have mentioned before that the Beatles sort of had to define how to, archive bands, how to recontextualize bands, how to, look back in an organized fashion. So, you know, these organizers are kind of in uncharted territory.
I think he must have taken a bit of a bath on that.
Oh, absolutely.
Mark Lewison does talk about a few hundred people wandering aimlessly around stalls in this
Yeah.
kind of giant cavernous space. Um, but we want to take a quick look at what you could have seen if you were
Yes.
there.
What could you have enjoyed?
Well, you would have trotted along hoping to see a scheduled screening of Shea Stadium, but
Did that
sadly
happen? No.
that didn't happen. And the big highlight was a live transatlantic phone call from John in New York with Radio Luxembourg DJ Tony Prince.
And did that happen?
That didn't happen either. But a film copy of Magical Mystery Tour was shown illegally on a
Hooray.
projector screen. I imagine that was someone's bed sheet
Yep.
taped to the wall. Alan Williams, the original manager, was there signing his book, "The Man Who Gave the Beatles Away."
Hmm.
Indeed, and but the highlight, the highlight is the auction, and this is just nuts.
Okay.
This auction, so you could buy original uh, Stuart Sutcliffe paintings. There was an exhibition; they were available um, to buy,
Yeah,
and
that is amazing to consider that you could have wandered into Ali Bally and bought a Stuart Sutcliffe
and
original.
they were selling them sort of by the pound, so like the small paintings were cheaper than the big paintings. And best of all, there was a Beatles karaoke sound alike competition. You'd have been able to do your Paul impression.
Excellent.
A Beatles quiz, we'd have won that,
Yes.
and also an auction. So you could have bought buy various pieces of memorabilia, and you could have bought George Harrison's suit, the original suit that he wore during the filming of Help in that scene on Salisbury Plain. Now, I think we could, think how much would you pay for that today?
Well, in 21st century cash, we're talking a reasonable five-figure sum, I'd
Yeah,
imagine,
yeah.
minimum.
So in 1976, some lucky punter bought it for £200.
Oh my word! Still a lot of money at the time, but
Yes, I mean, I crunched the numbers, and you think five-figure sum, that was £1,300 in today's
okay,
money.
okay. Gosh, that's the price of a decent iPad.
That's the price of a Paul McCartney box set. Um,
Actually, well, you may laugh, but yes, that's the price of every copy of McCartney 3.
Yeah, but I mean that's insane that
That
you
is
could you,
insane.
you could have an original Beatles outfit for £1,300. You could put that on your credit card, pay it off over a couple of years. I mean,
Well, it's something we should look at another time. It's kind of the early '80s when this kind of the auction houses get involved,
it is.
and
It's really 1980
that all shifts.
that's out.
So it's a bit of a netherworld in the '70s.
Yeah, but that the absolute highlight, and I have scoured the internet for a photograph of this. There were four giant Beetle effigies,
Right.
inflatable effigies, which due to an unfortunate accident deflated, which is a sort of, I think,
That's a
commentary on.
metaphor for the whole
It's
thing.
a metaphor for the whole thing. And the event was actually covered in NME the following week. There was a sort of photograph supposedly of the near empty venue, and you think in 1976, the NME must have had an absolute ball
Mocking the
with
Fabs.
that just punk year zero. So yes, clearly the Beatlemania was at a low point.
Yeah, well, Alexandra Palace is a big place, or Ali Pali as it's known, and I used to live up the road, and you often see it in documentaries as it's where the 24-hour Technicolor Dream
Yes,
was, and it's quite a big cavernous kind of convention hall space. It still exists, and it's in a lovely part of London. It's worth a visit. The other kind of Beatle business in 1976 was the Magical Mystery Tour album got an official UK release, and 76 was the year when EMI kind of got back the rights to reissue all the Beatles. So all the Beatles singles had been
yes,
coming out, and singles box sets had been coming out, and all they had all charted, and it was all a bit
it all
crazy and messy when all these compilations start to happen.
it all starts here, and also in December of this year. This is the first sort of rumors start circulating in early December about the Star Club tapes coming out.
Oh yeah.
Um, so this is, again, we touched on that previously, and maybe we'll do an entire episode on the Star Club tapes. But um, these are first sort of circulating that these are available and about to come out. I remember reading that in the music press.
Hmm. So if we break down the individual Beatles, there isn't really much for Ringo and George in Christmas '76. There's no new releases. There's nothing specific going on for either of them.
No, I think Ringo's probably lying low after the failure of Rotogravure
Mm.
to set the charts alight, and he'd had a single, "Hey Baby," in November, which really did nothing. And this is the point at which I think you can say, okay, Ringo's music career, there's a bit of a, shall we say, hiatus going on. He'll still be recording and putting things out, but it's not happening.
Yeah, and not to make light of it, there's probably some lifestyle issues as well that are taking over. It's
Very
hard to deal with these things.
delicately
Uh,
put.
John in Christmas '76, he's like 75. He's in this house husband phase. He's a new parent, and he has citizenship. He has his U.S. citizenship, but by the end of '76, so he's able to stay and he's able to travel.
He's in a good place, and
Yeah,
I find a little note saying on New Year's Eve he celebrated at a restaurant with James Taylor and Carly Simon. He and Yoko.
very
And
good.
don't you think that's an odd foursome?
Well, James Taylor and Carly Simon. I mean, geez, there's books about that. Not a very functional relationship from what we
No, I mean
know.
Carly Simon. I don't know if you've read Carly Simon's autobiography.
I have not.
It's a very strange book. I almost I read it almost not wanting to keep turning the page, but I could not look away. But you just think sort of James Taylor and Carly Simon and John and Yoko. I mean, they must have been the two most famous sets of celebrity couples in America at the time.
Yeah. And then for Paul, well, Paul has got a lot of albums under a lot of Christmas trees because it's the Christmas that Wings Over America comes out. And Wings Over America, um, first of all, I think it's great, but obviously it's a live album that also had an awful lot of studio attention paid to it. I think Paul was in there for about 6 or 8 weeks going through tapes and
Or is it?
maybe tweaking a few bits and pieces.
I always think of it as sort of a studio album with some live overdubs. No,
Well, well, there's a bit of, I mean,
I
there
think
was a
that
lot of that about at the time. There's the Thin
yeah.
Lizzy album and all that kind of
Lizzie
stuff
album.
that,
I think the thing is probably the vocals. The vocals are spectacular on that album, and
yeah.
I think a lot of the vocal harmonies were overdubbed. But it is a fantastic album. It's one of my favorite Paul
Yes.
albums, and it's definitely rock Paul is front and center.
Well, it's the culmination of all of that. It's the culmination of the 6 years since he left the Beatles. So this triple album comes out. It's sells a ton,
Yeah,
and it does. As a live album, it does what live albums are supposed to do. It kind of documents a moment in time and says this is the thing that happened.
yeah,
And what I think mightn't have been obvious at the time, but you could sometimes say it in retrospect, is that Wings Over America is actually the other another finishing of something. He
yes.
has kind of accomplished everything that needs to be accomplished. And actually, things get a bit more loosey goosey afterwards.
Yeah, I mean it is sort of peak rock Paul, and then Wings. They start to revert back to the sort of poppier end of things with sort of little excursions back into to the rock sound.
Yeah.
The other thing that's interesting, two things I think are interesting about this is one, there's a terrible TV commercial. Um,
Oh, is there for Wings
yeah,
Over America? I
for
haven't seen that.
Wings Over America, and also he reverses the writing credit on the half a dozen or so Beatles songs. So they're all,
Yes.
I've just seen a face and yesterday are all credited to McCartney, Lennon. And do we hear from John about that? No, we
No.
don't. He
No.
doesn't. He doesn't care. Or I mean, I can't imagine that he doesn't know that that's happened, but
Yes.
nothing happens. Well, you think that has become such a sort of bone of contention post 1980. You think where Yoko assumes that mantle, the sort of keeper of the flame, and everything is seen through that prism, and
But
that.
he's still talking about it in 2020 interviews. And the reality is, as far as I know, there's no legal reason why he can't list the songwriting credits as McCartney Lennon.
I think it's the fact just that they're registered in that way.
Right.
But that perhaps he needs permission. I don't know. I know we have a couple of copyright lawyers listening to the podcast. They can let us know. But I just think it's interesting that John doesn't know or doesn't care.
I remember, I wish I'd written this down, but I remember reading years ago that there is a linguistic reason why Lennon and McCartney scans better than McCartney Lennon. I think it's called linguistic scansion or something. It's to do with how the uh, the vowel sounds across Lennon and McCartney. You've got
Mm.
the short vowel sounds before the long vowel sounds. That's why it sounds better than McCartney Lennon. Anyway, there is a poetic reason for it, and it's got some kind of very long, highfalutin name attached to it.
Okay. The other thing that I was looking at a couple of sources here. Linda has a book out. So this
Yep.
is this is her first sort of photograph book comes out. But one of the interesting rumors flying around at this time is that Eric Stewart is going to replace Jimmy McCulloch
Oh,
in Wings. So Eric Stewart of 10cc, and that just I think it's in Melody Maker that just a little paragraph comes up that um, almost like a gossip column.
yes.
And that's interesting that sort of is 10 years prefigures, I suppose, Eric's Stewart's almost joining Paul in the sense that lots of co-writes on Press to Play, etc. But that was floating around since then.
That's interesting that, yeah, back then I mean, it's interesting to see 10cc spoken about as being in parallel with McCartney's work.
Yeah, I mean, well, you tend to forget, and I mean, I'm not sure did 10cc really have a huge impact in the States, in America. I mean, they were certainly huge in the UK. So, I mean, I suppose it's a bit of a trope that each next songwriting team that comes along, the new Lennon and McCartney, but 10cc was certainly spoken of in that
Now
context.
I've double checked this. The reason why Lennon and McCartney sounds better than McCartney Lennon is called ablaut reduplication. That
Oh,
is the
of course.
linguistic trick that's happening at that point. So it's why, TikTok sounds normal and talk tick doesn't sound weird. It's to do with repeating and reduplicating vowel sounds within a phrase.
So,
So you
but
say big bad wolf, not bad big wolf. You say chit chat, not chat chit. You say tittle tattle, not tattle tittle. Lennon and McCartney, not McCartney Lennon. There you go.
Stephen and Jason, it's the same thing.
Well, it is actually. And so ablaut reduplication. You
So
heard it here first, folks.
we should just stick with Stephen and Jason.
That's fine by me.
That's fine.
Um, so
Can-
that's yes.
I have one amusing anecdote about George. So George is kind of lying low as well at this point. He is getting lawyered up for the My Sweet Lord litigation that we talked about. This is kind of happening. Also, this must be. It occurred to me. This must be around the time that George is suing Ringo
Oh
over,
yes.
over Rotogravure, because Rotogravure comes out sort of late in the year, doesn't do very much, but then George is suing him for some reason that we never really
We think
got.
it's a sound alike. He puts a sound
Yeah,
alike George.
yes, George has given him a song when every song is sung, and he uses Lon Van Eaton to produce this guitar solo, which is you would imagine is George if you listening to it. George not having a particularly good time. He's got a best of out that EMI have put out with it's just shockingly
It's
shot
very poor.
shoddy piece of work, and they've done this to undermine sales of 33 and a third. And but for Christmas, George drops into the 70 Sound hi-fi shop in London, where he requests a copy of each of his 6 BBC Two Rutland Weekend videotapes. So if Eric Idle wasn't prepared to put them out, George was getting copies made. You like to think he was handing those out as Christmas presents?
Gifts. I do like the notion of that's how you went get your videotapes in
Yeah,
1976. That
you
it
had
was
to get them.
so super specialized.
Yeah,
Not that you could just request anything from the archive. That's
and
quite
it
nice.
cost him £194.
My gosh, he could have bought his suit from Help for
He
that.
could have done that. He could have, but he doesn't pay the bill until October 1980. So
This is gold.
this is the
Uh,
minutia of
this is what we're here for.
yeah.
So that's Christmas 76. Christmas 77, the Beatles have a love songs compilation in the top 10. But if we look for George, Ringo, and John, there's not a whole lot for Christmas 77 that we can point towards, really, is there?
No, I don't really know what George was doing in 1977. Presumably sitting in front of the fireplace writing another
Trying to write another song
trying
about
to write another
fire.
song. Ringo again, not so much. He does appear at the end of the year. I'm not sure it's December. There's an album, Scouse the Mouse,
Oh, yeah.
which is a sort of little animated thing, and he sings on 8 of those 15 tracks. I'm reading this from notes, but I have to hold my hand up and say I'm not familiar. I am as unfamiliar with Scouse the Mouse as I am with Bruce McMouse.
Yeah,
Mouse.
Scouse the Mouse sounds like one of those Paul cartoons, doesn't it?
I bet you Paul wished he'd gone with Scouse the Mouse rather than Bruce
Yeah, it
McMouse.
makes more sense. Bruce McMoose. John is still in house husband mode. But you know what? None of this matters, Stephen, because in Christmas 77, there is one man who is dominating the scene. And
It's
that man
Johnny
is
Rotten.
Mike Yarwood. No,
No,
that man is Paul McCartney, because Christmas 77 is the Christmas of Mull of Kintyre. And
Christmas belongs to Paul.
Christmas
It
does
does,
belong to Paul.
absolutely does belong to, but the whole of the end of the year belongs to Paul.
And Mull of Kintyre is, well, I think it's a great song. But it is an interesting song because it has a huge resonance, I think, on this side of the Atlantic
Yeah.
because it was such a massive hit at the time. It doesn't really have the same impact or resonance for American listeners.
No, no.
Like I think if Paul dropped Mull of Kintyre into a US concert, it'd be very different to,
Everyone
a
would
lot.
everyone go to the bar.
Well, no, yeah, nobody. I don't think people. Not many people wouldn't know it. Whereas if you played it in the UK, I think, oh, people are like, hey, Mull of
Yeah,
Kintyre, it's all good.
yeah. Yes, in America it didn't chart. There was a B-side, Girls' School.
Mm.
I think it was a double A side in both countries, maybe, but certainly in America it was Girls' School, which is a very problematic
Yeah,
song in
yeah.
2020, sort of politically and not PC at all.
And it's, Paul is still persisting in 1977 with the notion of a standalone single because Mull
Yeah,
of Kintyre isn't tethered to any Wings album. We're in between. We're still in the kind of the void between Venus and Mars and London Town.
yeah,
So it's a standalone single, and it comes out and it absolutely dominates the Christmas charts. Not only that, but it becomes the biggest selling single in UK history up until that time. It eventually gets eclipsed in 1984 by Band Aid. Do They Know It's Christmas?
yeah.
But it sells over 2 million copies, and it's everywhere.
It is. I mean, Knox, "She Loves You" was the biggest selling single before that, so that must have been quite satisfying
Yeah,
for Paul. You said at the when you began talking about the song, you said, "I like Mull of Kintyre,"
I do like Mull
as
of
if you were
Kintyre.
waiting for me to say, "I hate Mull of Kintyre." Um, I think the song is excellent. I really liked it when it first came out, and it was a difficult thing. It was a difficult time to like Paul McCartney and to like Mull of Kintyre because
Yes.
this was, the punk wars were raging, and you had to meet in secret to listen to Paul McCartney records, and you couldn't admit your affiliation to Wings.
Well, it's amazing. The punk wars were so well fought that Mull of Kintyre became the biggest selling single of all time. Well done, guys.
The moms and dads were still out there buying things, but no, it's great, and I mean, I'm often quite critical of the way Paul writes sort of pastiche
Yes.
songs. If you want a kind of 1920s Fred Astaire number, well, you give me the answer. If you want a kind of heavy rock song, here's Girls' School. But and I this at first instance it kind of seems a bit like pastiche. It's a sort of Scottish folk song, but he clearly has such genuine affection for the subject matter that it sort of transcends the pastiche, and it has, I think, become a sort of a modern classic.
Yeah,
It,
it does that great Paul McCartney thing of, it's an original song, but you think it's been
it's
there for years.
exactly, and but it's got quite a history. It goes back. We talked in 1974 episode about the piano tape,
Yes,
and
and it appears on that,
yeah,
where he's just riffing on it.
and it's fairly complete.
Yeah, and
Um,
Denny gets the co-write, which
and
seems
Denny gets,
strange.
and you think, what did Denny bring to the table here? If it was there in 1974, it's not recorded until August 1977. It's recorded at High Park Farm in Scotland, and it's got the local Campbelltown pipe band and Paul's vocal and guitar recorded outside, so it's got
Yes.
that nice kind of vibe. Um,
Well, the legend is that Paul and Denny were hanging out a bit again in Wingsland, and they went for a walk, and they had a bottle of whiskey, and they had guitars on their backs, and they knocked out the final version of Mull of Kintyre together. Isn't that the
yeah,
legend?
well, yes, but we know it existed in 1974.
Yes. So
So perhaps Denny's contribution was to bring the bottle of whiskey. I don't know, but you know, I think in the end, didn't Denny end up selling Paul his publishing because he had financial difficulties?
he did. He sold his rights back to Paul, and Paul was ready to buy.
Ready,
That's kind of the main thing.
ready to buy. And I have a couple of fun facts that I've dug up about this. The
Go.
1 millionth copy of the single was sold to a Mr. David Aykroyd, who
Okay.
got a gold disc for buying the 1 millionth copy and a hamper uh,
Ah.
from Paul at Soho Square. See, you wouldn't have turned down getting a hamper
Ah. No.
from Paul. There are 3 videos recorded,
Yes, there are.
uh, one of which has never been seen. So apparently there was one where they just all sat around a patio table
Hmm.
singing the song, and for some reason that was never released.
But the two we know is there's the one that's recorded in Scotland where the pipers are on the beach and it's filmed and it's got baby
Yeah.
James in it because
Yes.
James is only a few months old at the time. And then there's a studio version, isn't there, where they're sitting around a fake.
Like fake fire.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I want to see the patio table video. They just that videos were just people sitting around things.
And there is kind of a very significant bit of publicity that happens around Mull of Kintyre, which is
Yes,
the Christmas Mike Yarwood show appearance. Should we talk about that for a moment?
I think we could do an hour and a half on Mike Garwood. You're gonna have to explain to listeners who aren't in the UK and of a certain age who and what Mike Yarwood
Oh,
was.
happily. I think, well, I think you've hit it the nail on the head. If you are, from this part of the world and you are of a certain age, you'll know exactly who Mike Yarwood was. He was a TV impressionist who kind of came up through the clubs in the 60s and 70s, and by the mid 70s had been given a show on the BBC called Mike Yarwood in Persons. And he was unfathomably popular. He was huge. And
Yes,
he was huge, I think, because impressionists were probably a new thing in the UK. They were kind of a go-to on American chat shows
yeah,
and all the rest, but I think they were reasonably new in the UK. But Jarwood also had this thing where he would use the prevailing TV technology at the time to appear with himself. So he could be two or three characters on screen at the same time using chroma key backlay TV trickery. So he could be dressed up as three people. But and they'd all be talking to each other, and that seemed fantastically clever at the time. But I think some of his impressions are like, oh, he's holding a pipe. He must be Jim Callahan kind of thing, or
yeah.
whatever it was. The politicians of the day. There'd be all these.
Harold Wilson was the pipe.
Oh, sorry, pardon me, Harold. How? Oh, there you go. I'm so young. Harold Wilson was the pipe. Well, then he'd put on the thick glasses, and he'd be Robin Day. Oh, he must be Robin Day.
Yeah,
He's put his glasses on, and so Mike Yarwood was this big star at the time, and so Paul wasn't touring, but Mull of Kintyre was this massive hit, and so the one big bit of publicity that Paul and Wings do is to appear on the Mike Yarwood Christmas show, and again, this is we talk UK and light entertainment kind of has a different approach to Christmas than I think maybe in the US, where the Christmas number one on the charts is important. Christmas Day television is very sort of TV specific, and the BBC were dominant in 1977. And
yeah.
the block of TV that they had on Christmas Day in 1977 was Bruce Forsyth's Generation Game, followed by Mike Yarwood's Christmas Special, followed by Morecambe and Wise's Christmas Special. And all of those shows got over 20 million viewers. And the one that won was Mike Yarwood right in the middle with about
That's that
22 million.
that. Looking back, that's inexplicable.
It's a huge amount. Well, three channels and
I know,
nothing
but
else
no,
to
no.
do.
I mean, of Bruce Forsyth,
Yeah.
Morecambe and Wise, and Mike Yarwood. That you tend to think in the UK, you tend to think well, Morecambe and Wise just dominated everything.
Well, we're heading into Christmas now, and Morecambe and Wise are scheduled to be on the TV again across Christmas.
Yeah,
Morecambe and Wise, who appear on Anthology One and whose comedy I still love and many people love, they have not gone away. Bruce Forsyth was still a light entertainer up until 5 years ago, and he passed away. He was still hosting Saturday Night TV in the UK. Um, but Mike Yarwood is not getting repeated over
no,
Christmas. He is
no.
not particularly remembered as a he's remembered essentially as we're talking about him as a kind of curio.
Yeah, I don't remember his Christmas shows in particular. We should explain when you say that Morecambe and Wise are appearing still on BBC, that they're appearing from beyond the veil. That
They
these
are. So
they're
Eric
long.
Morecambe died in 1984, and but their Christmas shows are so good and so legendary. They still get repeated every Christmas, without fail. You'll find them somewhere on the schedule. So I think Christmas Eve this year, BBC
Yeah.
Two is Morecambe and Wise Day, and they're still funny. They're great.
So the campaign for a Mike Yarwood Day starts here, does it?
Oh God, no, no. I mean, here's the joy of living in the future, folks. Is of course you can go onto YouTube and you can
Yep.
watch the Mike Yarwood 1977 Christmas Day special, and it's a long watch. It's
I was going to
not.
say it's not compulsory to watch the whole thing. I'm going to put a link. We put
Yes, we'll
link.
put up links to it. But there's two interesting things. One is obviously that Wings come on and do Mull of Kintyre, and Wings at this point are Paul, Linda, and Denny.
Yeah.
So they're again back into this threesome mode, which they kind of, up until the London Town comes out the following year, they're still in Wings threesome mode, which is a bit odd and curious. So they appear sitting on stools and singing Mull of Kintyre. But the other fun part is that Paul appears in a sketch with Mike Yarwood.
Yeah, I think you're using the word fun there in an entirely misleading fashion.
Well,
Paul is, to be fair, Paul is pretty good in a kind of long suffering. I'm going to read he lines from a cue card. He could be on SNL.
he could be, and there's nothing wrong with that, and we know he has holiday time. But he appears in the sketch, and it's funny, the sketch is Paul is sitting in a room and he plays a piano, and at the start he hears someone coming and he hides a bunch of money inside the piano, which is amusingly
No change there.
not comically deft. But then Mike Yarwood walks in and he's dressed as Dennis Healy. And for those of a younger disposition at the time, Dennis Healy was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Minister for Finance, the Treasury Minister, whatever you'd want to call it around the world.
Yeah.
Yes. So he is in charge of the purse strings of the UK. And so Mike Yarwood is Dennis Healy, but he's not just Dennis Healy, is he, Stephen?
No, he's Dennis Healy dressed as a punk.
Yeah, and he calls himself Chunky Punky to the hilarity of the audience. It's not funny at all.
It's the fact that this is 1977. All you have to do to get a laugh from the older generation who are watching this, or the young kids, is to dye your hair, put it in a mohawk,
Spike it up, yeah.
put a pretend safety pin through your nose. And punk has been assimilated like the Borg in Star Trek. It has been assimilated into.
Well, that is what is fascinating about it, because we do get sold this notion of the punk wars and the punks were great. And so if you want to keep your timeline in check, 77 was the year of punk. It's right at the end of 76 when the Pistols go on TV and swear. 77 is the year when they move around all their labels and they get Nevermind the Bollocks out and all the rest. And but it's interesting that by Christmas 77, punk has become, within just 12 months, this kind of shorthand for something that's silly or a bit of a joke or a gag, and we'll just dress up as a punk.
It's a punchline. It's just it's a punk line.
Hey, I see what you did there. And but it's they sell themselves as being, we were a threat to the establishment. You're like, nah, you were just you just were rolled into the light entertainment.
It was a little blip, and it was this kind of assimilated into the fodder for light entertainment.
So this sketch goes on for a long time, where Dennis Healy, dressed as a punk, throws these lines back and forth to Paul, and Paul is just thinking of the album sales, how many people are going to nip into Woolworths in the post-Christmas period to pick up another 1,000,000 copies of Mull of Kintyre. And perhaps the funniest bit is at the end of the sketch, Denny Lane and Linda walk in, and Denny Lane obviously ad-libs, just looks at Mike Yarwood dressed as Dennis Healy and goes, "Hi, Mike," and just totally ignores him and starts talking to Paul. And that's quite funny, actually.
That is very funny. I mean, if that could be the highlight of Denny Lane's career. But seriously, I'm surprised that Mike Yarwood left that in or didn't insist. Perhaps he was big enough to think, oh yeah, that was funny, that was a laugh. It is kind of redolent of that Morecambe and Wise show, where at one point Morecambe makes Lennon laugh, and they do
Yes.
kind of you can see suddenly they're off the script and they're kind of looking at each other, and there's a genuine moment. It is a genuinely kind of spontaneous
Yeah,
moment.
a laugh is a laugh. Why would you edit that out, I
Yeah.
suppose? And it is the only genuine laugh in that sketch. So yeah, go off and watch Paul McCartney and Chunky Punky. Tee it up for about 7 o'clock on Christmas Day if you want to relive the 1977
I was
experience.
going to say if you have unwanted guests that you want to send home, put that on.
So Mull of Kintyre is great. I said I'm very fond of Mull of Kintyre. I remember it was one of the first songs I ever learned to play on the guitar. It's very easy to play because bagpipes are so hard to compose to. Their range is so limited.
Just put that guitar away, Jason. We
Put
don't
it.
need.
Shall I sing it for you all now?
No, we don't
You
need to.
sure? Okay, fine. So that's Christmas '77, dominated by Mull of Kintyre, but it does sort of point towards this sort of vagueness that existed in Wings after the Wings Over
Yeah.
America success. What do they do next? So let's go to Christmas '78. From a Beatle point of view, we have the first Beatles box coming out. The Beatles album box comes out in
Yes.
November '78, and that's got the rarities disc that they promise is never going to get a standalone
No,
release.
it's never
You have
ever.
to buy the box set.
You have to. This is the Beatles Collection, which was a big blue box set with sort of nice gold embossed writing, and the draw was that you had this rarities LP, and even rarities. It was sort of mixes and things that were only available on B sides and that sort of thing. But you definitely could not. Uh,
Never. You were never
never.
going
It
to
was
see it outside
never
the box.
ever
You
going
have to buy the whole box.
to happen. You had to spend a huge amount of money to buy the box, and it was never going to be released, or at least not until October 1979.
What? Oh, nonsense.
It's these marketing companies, and
They were up to their old tricks back then,
yeah. And we should say this is an entirely different Rarities album to the US Rarities album, which doesn't come out until March 1980, because again, just reflecting different mixes and things.
Yeah, and the rarities thing, it's kind of like a part past masters, part
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
not like unreleased stuff. We're not.
No, this isn't the sort of sessions LP that was
Yeah.
rumored at the time of unreleased. This is just collecting odd mixes and B sides and the German versions of She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand, that type of thing.
So for Christmas '78, then John is still house husband mode. Nothing particularly public going on. Ringo, nothing particularly public going on. George though hits the stage in December 1978, doesn't he?
Yes. So you got him appearing on stage with Eric Clapton and Elton John.
What a surprise!
And you think this will be great, and uh, this is Eric Clapton and his Rolling Hotel was nice, but this is
What
kind
were
of
they rolling? I wonder.
this is on the floor. I mean, this is Eric's peak alcoholic haze time, and if you saw that A Life in 12 Bars film that came
Yes,
out,
which
uh,
is very depressing. I mean,
it's not an uplifting
it
Christmas
felt
movie.
like some kind of penance that he was putting it out as some sort of agreement to his sobriety. I don't know.
I suspect there is an element of that it's a kind of 12 part of the 12-step program that you have to apologize to people and make amends, but it's a fascinating watch, but it's a hard watch. But there's a little clip of George just kind of standing off to one side in a terrible hat, playing Farther On Up the Road, and it, again, we can probably put a clip up of that. But he also appears with Mick Ralphs, Simon Kirke, Ian Pace, John Lord, and your favorite Boz Burrell from King Crimson. Um, uh, and they are called
Oh, you say it. Cover your ears if there's any children in the car.
Piss Hole Artists.
The pisshole artists. That's hilarious.
Is this just in a local pub in Henley?
Yep.
You think you're in there with your good lady wife enjoying a sweet sherry at Christmas, and suddenly Mick Ralphs, Simon Kirke, Ian, half of Deep Purple, and George Harrison appear. That would, no one wants to see that.
But for Christmas '78, Paul is still making hay, and that's the Christmas when he's once again getting into people's stockings with Wings' Greatest, which is a good compilation. It's still in print after all these years. He obviously still rates it because it came out on vinyl reissue a year or two ago. It's never gone away, Wings' Greatest.
No, I mean, you would think on the face of it, it's been superseded by Wingspan or Pure McCartney, but it's still there. But it's an opportunity to sell things to us on colored vinyl. We know Paul likes that.
Yes, and if you're being totally pedantic about these things, and heaven forbid we'd be pedantic about things on this podcast. It's not
No,
really Wings' Greatest. It's got like solo. It's got a standalone single like Paul's Another Day on it, and that's fine.
It is, but there is that sort of blurring, and that that happens on Wingspan as well. He seems to, he famously in concert once introduced, here's a Wings song for you, and played Too Many People. So I know he doesn't get hung up on these things, but
No,
he,
he doesn't. And if you're in him in the middle of it, I guess you don't really pay attention to it. I think the most fun thing about Wings Greatest is that the story behind its crazy cover, which seems like an innocuous looking cover, but it's not.
no, I mean, so this is the sort of little statuette, which is a sort of Art Deco uh, Wings representation of something, I'm sure, and they decided they wanted to take a photograph of it in snow, presumably because this was coming out for the Christmas market.
Yeah.
So they did what any normal person would do in the 70s. They flew the statuette to the Alps.
Yes, and found a location, possibly in a helicopter, and then filmed it in the mountain sunshine.
Did nobody have fake snow in the 70s? Is this fake snow a relatively
Wow.
new invention?
Well, there was certainly snow in the music business in '78, Stephen. You know what I'm saying?
I
But
hear you. I hear you.
hey, pretty subtle joke there. But
Um,
I guess it
and
was the thing you do. I mean, yeah,
it is a kind of quintessential 1970s rock music excess.
yes.
I mean, it's ridiculous, is what
It is kind of ridiculous
it is
when
ridiculous.
I mean it's something I only read about on Wikipedia a few years ago, and I was like, "What? That picture is in the Alps? They all
Well,
went location scouting in the Alps?"
there's no context at all. I mean, there's nothing. It's not. There isn't the Matterhorn, isn't in the background. There's nothing.
Yes,
It's just some white snow.
and the scale of the statue, you get to see the statue again because it pops up on the cover of Back to the Egg.
Back to the egg, back there on the mantelpiece.
It's on the mantelpiece, so it's not even a very large statue. So yeah,
No, well, I suppose a large statue couldn't have. I suppose it's not like they floated a giant replica down the Thames or anything.
no,
No
that's
one
all.
would be that crazy.
That's not what people would do. So yeah, the Wings greatest, a bit of a time killer, a stocking filler, coming out at the end of '78, which leads us into 1979 and the end of the decade. And whenever you get to the end of a decade, it leads to a bit of people like to look back and think about things. And the BBC probably does the mother of all its Beatles at Christmases.
Yeah.
I think it's their last kind of Beatles at Christmas because what they do is they show six movies across the whole Christmas season, including Shea Stadium and Magical Mystery Tour, which hadn't been shown since the '60s. And so they have this big end of decade Beatles retrospective blowout.
It would have been nice if they'd shown Magical Mystery Tour in black and white on Boxing Day. Just
Just to replicate the
to
sensation.
replicate the success of first time around. This is probably the first time that I saw the Let It Be movie. I think, although it had been on BBC One a year or two before it premiered, but I think this is, and I recorded it on Betamax, which may be somewhere in the roof space.
If you can
Um,
find that, that's there are
is it worth?
people who will pay. Well, they won't pay, but they'll take it off your hands and
I
digitize
was
it
going
and
to
stick it
say,
up
yeah,
on
I
YouTube.
was going to say, if will somebody pay me for that? But it's odd that the BBC, this had become a sort of Christmas tradition with the BBC, to have Beatle themed days, but this is really the last one, so they're rounding out the decade. It's almost like the BBC are saying, right, that's fine, that's passé now. We'll move on.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like saying we got to the end of the '70s. Hey, remember the '60s? Let's look at these blocks in time. But the BBC are still making hay. As we record this in 2020, there's a lot of Paul across the BBC this Christmas. There's Paul with Idris Elba. They're showing Paul at the Cavern from 2018. There's one or two other kind of Paul bits and pieces popping up. It's almost as if he has an album out.
Is there an album out?
Is there an album out?
You think he'd have mentioned it? We think we'd have heard something if
Well,
if he was.
well, in a few years' time, when we're doing Beatle Christmases in the 2020s, we'll find out.
We'd be able to look back.
We'll figure out what's going on. But I know that this 1979 Beatles at the BBC blowout, a lot of people remember it. A lot of people got, turned on to the Beatles at that time, who were too young in the '60s. And, you can actually go onto YouTube and see some of the BBC continuity where they're like, and now on BBC Two, Magical Mystery Tour. There's all that kind of stuff you can see.
I certainly remember 1979. I was in the midst of my kind of Beatles obsession, and yeah, so it was great. So I have a very clear memory of that. Also, a very clear memory of being disappointed not to get the Beatles Rarities album for Christmas. I
Oh,
do
really?
remember that. Yes,
You got
because
it
it had.
eventually, I assume. You had
I
some
got it
time
eventually, but it had come out. We talked about this
for
in
78. Yeah, it was in the
for
box in
78. So,
78.
so suddenly, they bowed to public pressure, and October they'd released it as a standalone. So take that, all you people who had paid hundreds of pounds for the for the box.
And so, yeah, Christmas, there's not much for Ringo for Christmas 79. George may or may not have been just tinkering away in Friar Park doing somewhere in England business. We're not really too sure.
It's mostly log fires with George, I think, at
It's
Christmas.
all log fires. He takes his Christmas off, and but John is doing a bit of estate management, some kind of wise stuff. So apparently he files or he writes his will in December 1979, and his estate is estimated at $30 million, compared to 10 years earlier when they couldn't get together the thousands of pounds needed to buy Northern songs. It's
Yeah,
it's the evolution of the 60s rock gods turning into multimillionaires kind of happens at the end of the 70s and into the 80s. And out of that 30 million estate, the will states that half of it goes to Yoko and half of it goes in trust for Sean, which is pretty wise and smart, I suppose.
pretty kind of standard fare. It's a bit rough on Julian, I suppose, but
Well, that gets contested in due course, doesn't it?
so it's given that we all know sort of the events of 1980, it's it's a sensible sort of estate planning. But the other thing is they're winding up companies at this stage, so sort of bag productions and things like that all get wound up at the end of the year on
That's very
31st of
symbolic.
December.
Yeah, the 31st of December, these big
Yeah,
totems of what they were doing at the start of the decade just get put to bed.
yeah. So this is after 5 years of house husbanding, and we know that's slightly exaggerated. We know that he did pick up his guitar, he was writing demos, but there is a sense of something ending and a line being drawn.
But it is worth pointing out again that, there wasn't any sense on Christmas Day, 1979, that John was like, well, next year I'm going to go into the studio and make Double Fantasy and get back to it all. That wasn't part of the plan at all. As far as he knew, it was going to
No,
be more of the same. So, without advertising yet another episode, but in our 1980 episode, you kind of see how his evolution and progression back into the studio kind of happens with a degree of spontaneity.
yes, I mean, the he was working in the background, but he wasn't interested, and he was just essentially he'd retired. And I think Paul makes reference at various points in the late 70s when asked with that perennial question. He says, "No, John. The last time I spoke to him, he's finished. He's retired."
Yeah, yeah, and I guess that kind of suited Paul as well. So that leads us to Paul's Christmas 1979, and you have to say, Paul, calm down. It's not a race, relax. But he
It
is,
is. It is a race. It is a
but
race.
he is busy, and obviously the most important thing to ever happens in Christmas 79. It is the Christmas where Wonderful Christmas Time is unleashed onto an unsuspecting public, and
That we're
there's
we're we're now going to get 45 minutes from you
the
on
sky is
wonderful
black
Christmas
with
time.
hats.
Yes.
There's buntings hanging from the streets. People are delighted to hear Wonderful Christmas Time. But, I've defended Wonderful Christmas Time before. I'm sure some of you people listening at home might have heard of it. It stands as Paul's most popular solo song. If you follow streaming metrics, certainly, skipping out the Rihanna 4 or 5 second song, it's the one with the most numbers. It earns him hundreds of thousands of pounds in royalties every Christmas. It's inescapable. It's one of that handful of about a dozen songs that's kind of inescapable at Christmas time. But it comes out
It,
in November and it's in the top 10 for Christmas 79.
yeah, inescapable is a word I would use. This is a very odd song.
It is an odd song.
Because you know, um, Wings aren't over at this point. Wings are still there. Wings are still a functioning band. They're
Yeah.
recording and they're about to tour. And in the middle of August, he suddenly decides, you know what the world needs? It needs a standalone Paul McCartney Christmas song. Um,
Well, the
and
the chronology is interesting because particularly, in the era of McCartney 3 coming out, we're being told, well, he made McCartney 2 when Wings were falling apart. And we know that's not true. So
yeah,
Back to the Egg comes out at the start of summer 79. There isn't any immediate concurrent promo, which is a bit odd for Back to the Egg, but they are planning this Wings tour at the end of 79. And during his holidays, Paul goes off and he's got a few weeks on his own and he records just some stuff for a laugh, for a goof. And on one day in August 1979, from start to finish, he records everything on Wonderful Christmas Time. Synths, high synths, low synths, the guitars, the bass, the backing vocals, the ding-dongs, everything else. All that, he does it by himself. And it
yeah.
seems to be And, amazingly, people ask him about all sorts of things repeatedly in interviews, but nobody's ever specifically gone into whether it was written solely on the spot or whether it was kind of formed beforehand. But it seems to have been written roughly on the spot, like most of the McCartney 2 material. So Wonderful Christmas Time is from those weeks where he puts together McCartney 2. But he doesn't know it's McCartney 2 yet. So
No.
he says that he's driving around with this tape of songs and he's like, well, where did these go? But he is canny enough to realize back in August 79 that Wonderful Christmas Time reeks of a hit, that it's worth putting out. And it comes out as a solo Paul McCartney single. The first, it's actually technically, if I'm right, only the second ever solo Paul McCartney single after Another Day back in
Oh.
71. And
Well,
it doesn't have the
even
Wings
then,
name on it.
even then, I think Another Day was Paul and Linda. So
Mm. So yeah, so it's
that's a good pub quiz question. What was the first Paul McCartney solo single? We think it's Wonderful Christmas Time.
Is one I'm pretty certain Another Day. I can feel now. We'll have to send the Nothing Is Real librarian off. I'm pretty certain Another Day is just Paul, and Wonderful Christmas Time is the second one. But the point stands that he felt compelled to put it out because he probably felt it was a hit. There's a parallel universe where
Yeah.
it could have come out because it's such an odd sounding song. It could have come out as like with sort of a frog chorus type nomenclature or a fireman type pseudonym, that it could have been just Christmas Scouse McMouse, whatever he wanted to call himself, and put it out. But Wings are not done because Wings are in the video and
Yeah.
they're all hanging out, and Wings are about to go on tour. So it's kind of put out as a bit of a joke or a novelty.
Yeah. Do you think if you were in Wings, you'd have been a bit
Hmm.
concerned that your boss was suddenly recording solo and putting solo? Or I mean, this incarnation of Wings is a return or a step back towards rock Paul. It's a slightly
Yeah.
harder edged, the kind of synths and the I suppose literally yacht rock of London town is slipping away, and it's a harder edge thing. And Paul has said he wanted a harder edge thing, and then suddenly this wouldn't sit, I think, as a Wings track with this incarnation of Wings.
No, I think you're right. And in retrospect, you know, we're being told that McCartney 2 is this post Wings thing, which it's not. In retrospect, he must have been subconsciously testing the waters. So Wonderful Christmas Time does well. The
Mm,
next single that comes out is Coming Up, and then the McCartney solo album comes out. And in the interim, it's probably the trek to Japan that we talk about in the 1980 episode that kind of scuppers Wings. But Wings technically don't cease to exist till 1981.
no.
Everyone's kept on the payroll. Things are still kind of bubbling along in the background. And the truth is, he's just trying to figure out between 79 and 81 what it is exactly he wants to do. Is he, is each one of these steps, reaffirming or supporting his notion to leave Wings behind? The steps being Wonderful Christmas Time, Coming Up, McCartney 2, all that kind of stuff. The Japan episode, absolutely. But there certainly isn't a decisive thing where he's like, man, I've recorded Wonderful Christmas Time, time to kill Wings. That's certainly not what he's thinking.
No, no. No,
It's-
it's a song that I've heard him do live 2 or 3 times,
yes,
and with his current touring band. And much as I really don't care, and for the single, it might just be the sort of ubiquity at Christmas time. That this is, you just hear it everywhere.
yeah,
I do like it in the live version that he does with this band. I don't think I've heard a live version other than with this band, but it's great, and I would love him to kind of, like he did with Coming Up. Let's put out a live version as well.
yeah.
Record Store Day. Let's re-release it, and put a live version. Once you've got guitars and harmonies, and it's great. It's great.
And yeah, and he has sort of he's not shy about the song. He's quite happy to trot it out. So he plays it on Saturday Night Live in
Yeah.
2012 as part of a sketch.
Oh yes.
So if you haven't seen it, we'll put a link up. But it's the premise of the sketch is himself and Martin Short are cousins, and they're auditioning for a show, and Martin Short won't let his cousin sing, and then eventually cousin Paul doesn't want to play the triangle anymore. Cousin Caleb, he wants to sing his song, and the set falls back, and his band are there, and he sings Wonderful Christmas Time. I know you're not a fan.
It's as good a sketch as I've ever seen on Saturday Night Live.
Uh-oh, there you go. Well, we've got differing opinions on that. But, Paul is busy, and Wonderful Christmas Time is not the end of Wings, because the final Wings tour happens, and it's a UK tour of moderately sized venues. And there's some good footage out there of this tour. There's like a half-hour nationwide show, which follows some
Yeah.
sound checking in Liverpool. Um, from the tours from November the 23rd to December the 17th. And, it's got a good set list. He's opening his shows with Got to Get You Into My Life, and there's stuff from the first McCartney album there, and it's a really good eclectic set list.
This is the tour, the Wings tour. I think much as I love Wings over America, this is the tour and the set list I'd like to have seen. I think they were a great band, and I think it's a shame that we don't have a live album from this era. But hopefully, Back to the Egg Archive Deluxe will
Well,
will put that right if
the,
we ever get it.
there is an argument. Well, there's a, we've precedent that the Wildlife Red Rose Speedway gave us that Wings Europe live
Yeah,
album, and there's a precedent that a London Town Back to the Egg double up could give us maybe the last night at the Glasgow Apollo, because what we get from that last night of the tour at the Glasgow Apollo is the Wings version of Coming Up. And so again, this solo stuff isn't stymieing Wings. He puts out a single with solo Paul on one side, Wings on the other. It's like choose your own adventure.
and you think he was taking a poll at that stage? Vote for Paul solo or vote for Paul with
I
Wings.
don't know. I think he was hedging his bets. I think he was very uncertain.
Yeah,
Like Wings was a brand name. It was doing well. It was particularly doing well in North America, and it's the live coming up that is the hit in North America, and it's
yeah.
the studio one that's the hit in the UK, aided by that kind of video. So I don't.
The video is excellent. The video is that kind of where Paul is 10 or 12 Paul
Yes.
versions of Paul, which again, this Mike Yarwood probably was the consultant on that
I'm
video.
sure. Come to think of it now, yes, the connection to Mike Yarwood, it's all making sense, really. Yeah, that poll and that coming up video, as a very tiny child, I think I've said this before. I remember that being on television, and
How tiny a child were you?
how tiny.
You're just
I was, I
you
was
don't need to
probably, I
answer
must have been
that.
about 5, and
Oh,
I
right.
know. So I remember the coming up video. So I think Paul is hedging his bets.
Yeah.
He's not really, but it's kind of Wings kind of dies by attrition, as we've said. It's the success of McCartney 2, it's the Japan episode, and I think it's the retreat after the horrible events of December 1980. All of these things are like, and just the notion of, well, it's a 70s thing. It kind of gives it a certain parallel.
It again, there is that kind of the Beatles or the '60s, Wings or the '70s, and since then it's solo Paul. So there is, I suppose, this end of a decade is always a time for sort of contemplation or looking back or some kind of retrenchment. But as you say, it's a long, slow working out of that decision.
And so for the Christmas charts, Wonderful Christmas Time isn't the Christmas number one, but it is in the Christmas top 10. The UK Christmas number one is Pink Floyd's Another Brick in the Wall, which is one of those curiously, aberrantly, largely successful hit singles.
Yeah, and not particularly Christmassy, I would have
Not
thought.
no, not particularly Christmassy, but yeah, the last number one of the 70s was that. But even when the tour finishes on December 17th, there's still one very big piece of work left for Wings, and that's on December the 29th.
Yeah, so this is the final night of what was billed the concerts for the people of Kampuchea. So this was a run of 4 nights at Hammersmith Odeon, as was, to raise money for Cambodia, which Kampuchea, and Wings played the final night. They were the sort of the big act, but you had. Across the previous nights, you had the Who, Queen, Robert Plant, the Clash, the Pretenders, Elvis Costello, Rockpile with Dave Edmunds. So it's a sort of old school, new school. There's some new wave acts, there's some old school acts, and this is essentially organized, or Paul signs up or allows his name to go forward as organizer with Kurt Waldheim of the UN.
Yes, who is an interesting
You
figure to
can
say
you
the
you
least.
you you, you can Google Kurt
Yeah, you
Waldheim.
can Google that. All of this stuff is playing. It's tickling my childhood memories because I don't remember the gigs for Kampuchea, but I remember Blue Peter having a Christmas appeal around that time for
Were you were you
Cambodia, Kampuchea.
were you sending in bottle
I was
tops?
probably doing all that kind of stuff, and I do remember Pink Floyd being number one.
Yeah.
But Kampuchea, yeah, it's a really interesting thing, Kampuchea, and it's a pity that it has kind of disappeared because Bangladesh, we can still go out and buy and listen to the concert for Bangladesh, and the Kampuchea gigs are very much a late 70s London, meeting of the tribes, basically. As you say, there's the Who, there's Queen, there's Paul, there's members of Led Zeppelin, there's the
Yeah.
Pretenders, there's Elvis and the Attractions, there's the Clash. All the big hitters are there.
It's a very UK, very London centric gathering. And yeah, I mean, it surprises me. I do remember seeing uh, presumably just highlights of the show broadcast on British television at the time. But you would think the album, the TV show, the film, all of that could be repackaged, and Bangladesh is still out there earning money for UNICEF. That this might be able something to be done.
I was thinking about this though, because as far as I know, I think George set up his own charity to run
Yeah,
Bangladesh through, and who knows what the paperwork for Kampuchea is, but if it's something that instead of primarily coming from a figure like George is coming from a massive organization like the UN, it's going to be maybe lost. That paperwork's going to be lost in the midst of time, and you're dealing with some of the most those groups that are the most protective of their legacy, particularly Queen, particularly
yeah.
Paul, particularly Led Zeppelin, and the Who. These aren't people who just sort of sign off on straightforward reissues of stuff, but it is there is a wealth of material related to those gigs, and it is a pity that they have disappeared. It seems odd that you can't go and buy your 100 quid Kampuchea box set with all the audio and video in it.
Well, that would be, we'd buy that. We'd buy that.
We'd buy, yeah, I think we definitely would.
Um,
Um,
this is very, very, very strong parallels with Bangladesh, because again, this is something that Paul says. I saw a film of starving children. It was a soul searching bit of film, and again, there's that direct parallel with Bangladesh, and there were very strong rumors at the time that this was going to be a Beatles reunion.
Yeah, and 79 was a year where, everyone was on good terms. George, Ringo, and Paul, there's that picture of them with Lonnie Donegan at Eric Clapton's wedding to
Yeah.
Patty, and they'd wandered up on stage and been drunk for a few minutes and not really played anything useful. But there's certainly form for them hanging out. It's not the most unimaginable notion.
No, and Graham Thompson in his book Behind the Locked Door, that George biography, which we've mentioned before and recommend, he does say that George and Ringo were almost on board until the speculation started to run riot, and they backed off at that point. Now I'm not clear if that would have been George and Ringo and John, but certainly he seems to be saying that George and Ringo were on board. My recollection is that. Definitely there was that speculation, and certainly the review, the post concert review in NME or Melody Maker, focused very much on the fact that quite spiteful kind of comments about John not showing up.
Mm. And you think forward a few years, you do have George and Ringo jumping on stage for like the Princess Trust and all this
Yeah,
kind of stuff. It becomes more this sort of, the rock god charity gala thing becomes a bit more de rigueur in a few years' time.
it does. I mean, that really became a staple in the '80s, and and you have Paul fronting a band with people like Elton John and Tina Turner and Phil
Yeah.
Collins and the usual kind of crew that turn up at these things. And interesting that at no point do Paul, George, and Ringo uh,
All do the Princess Trust at the same
all do
time.
the
Yeah.
Princess Trust at the same time. I think at that stage in the '80s, it was a different vibe, and they were being very careful not to not to sort of cross that line. But Paul subsequently said, "All this was some woman." He says wrote in the Daily Mirror that she had evidence that it was definitely happening. Happening. That was rubbish. It wasn't happening, and it was just the papers. Um, but certainly there was a lot of speculation, and to the extent that the Hammersmith Odeon was sort of surrounded by fans, to the extent that after the afternoon sound check, the band couldn't leave.
Yeah.
Uh, so all they had to do was sit around all day and drink, according to Steve Hawley. And he's saying, he says it was pretty messed up. I don't think the performance was particularly good. I think that's maybe underselling it, but certainly, ABC announced that just before Wings went on stage, that they would pay $2,000 for as little as 2 minutes of film of a Beatles reunion.
You could
Well,
buy
we would pay two
You could,
thousand
I could
dollars.
rustle up 2 grand, I guess. Somehow you could
Yeah,
sell my George help suit that I bought at the 1976
yeah,
conference. Yeah, and this is what is not known at the time, but which comes true is that December the 29th, this Wings gig at Campuchia is the last ever Wings gig.
yeah.
They never play live again, and it ends with not only Wings, but you get two bands for the price of one. You get Wings as Rochestra.
Rochester.
Rockestry? Rockeria.
Rochester.
Rockaria.
Rocker.
Rockestra.
No, Jeff Lynne was not there.
Rockestra. The
So
Rockestra make their one sole live outfit. That's how wings go out on the highest of mighty highs.
yeah, do you want to tell us what Rochester or
Well, I'm
Rochester
sure if
is?
you're listening to this podcast, you know that Rockestra was a notion of Paul where he decided to have an orchestra of rock musicians, and they contributed 2 tracks to Back to the Egg. There is a documentary which is available of the Rockestra sessions in '79, which is available in like a 10th generation copy on YouTube. But the legend or the rumor is that it's locked up in copyright rights, likeness rights hell, because Paul filmed the Rockestra sessions in secret, like a nature documentary, behind fake walls and windows. And when members of of Led Zeppelin and co found out, they weren't really happy to sign away their likeness to get this documentary released. So it
What
seems to be in limbo somewhere.
what was he thinking?
He was
I,
thinking,
I mean, if
I'm Paul.
yeah, I mean, you think if he had turned up, you know, if John Paul Jones or Robert Plant or someone had said, you know, Paul, we're having this big thing, could you come along and play some bass? And he turned up and he found out that he'd been secretly filmed. He wouldn't be best pleased about that. So
No, it's a bit. I mean, I think it's a good idea because his notion was if they didn't know they were being filmed, he could get like a real film, and that is
yeah,
kind of what you get. And so that idea is good. But yeah, he wouldn't like it if he went to a
no,
session. If Elvis
no,
Costello said, "Oh, I filmed these sessions for Spike. Do you mind?" And it was all
yeah.
secret. But interesting, it's the Rockestra that gets the first Elvis Costello, Paul McCartney connection because Bruce Thomas from the Attractions plays on Rockestra on the record. I can't even say record anymore on the recordra, and also in the live gig. And he's
is,
listed on the Rockstar documentary as
is
Pete
it
or Bruce
is
Thomas. Pardon me, Bruce Thomas from Elvis Costello's band.
yeah, I was gonna say he's not from the Attractions. He's from Elvis Costello's band.
He's from
You know,
Yeah,
that's
he's from
why
Elvis Costello's
that's
band.
why that's why
So
he's
Bruce is on
introduced.
bass, Pete is on drums in the Attractions, but Bruce is the one who contributes to Rockestra. Rock,
Yeah, so
rock.
this live setup is a little it's a it's a different lineup. So you get the wing set and it's a great set. So you know got to get you into my life as the opener, and people must have thought when they heard that introduction, it's the Beatles.
The
Um,
Applejacks are coming.
the Applejacks are coming. You know, it hits all those boxes. You know, you get every night. You get Hot as Sun,
Yes,
everybody's favorite Paul McCartney.
without the lyrics though, so it's not really
Well,
much
it's
good.
it's 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 a shame because
Yeah.
obviously if this had been slightly later, Elaine Page would have come on and done a guest spot. But so yeah, so they finish with Band on the Run, and then they bring all these people on dressed in gold lame suits or sorry, silver lame suits and top hats.
So who's on
And
stage for that? Because it's a good
okay,
lineup.
it is a good lineup. You've got John Bonham, Billy Bremner from the Pretenders, Gary Brooker, Procol Harum, Harry Casey, who goes all the way back, I think, to the Cavern days, Dave Edmunds, Steve Hawley, James Honeyman Scott, Kenny Jones, John Paul Jones, no relation, Lawrence Juber, Denny Lane, Ronnie Lane, no relation, Linda McCartney, Paul McCartney, relation, Paul Plant, Robert Plant, and Bruce Thomas, and last but not least, Pete Townsend.
Yes, and Billy Bremner was from Rockpile. I'm going to correct you
Oh,
there, not the
sorry,
Pretenders,
sorry,
because I know
sorry,
people are going to be. You can put down your pitchforks, people.
sorry.
But it is a great lineup, and it's fantastic, and everyone wears the lame jacket except
Pete
Pete
Townsend.
Townsend. He's
He's
so difficult, isn't he?
he's having none of it.
Yeah,
He's his own man.
yeah, he won't be told. But
Also,
and Paul does
yeah,
get a bit vocal about it, but we won't repeat what Paul
we won't
says.
repeat that. Very politically incorrect
Mm.
for 30 or 40 years on. But yes, there's a fantastic the Rochester set list is the Rochester theme. Let It Be, Lucille, and as if that wasn't enough, they do the Rochester theme again. That's what everybody wants to hear a
It's
second
you
time.
go to a Rockestra gig. That's the track you're waiting for them to play,
That's the
isn't it?
track you're waiting for them to play. So I think it's in the middle of Lucille. Pete Townsend sort of lurches across the stage while Paul is singing, and he is just deranged, absolutely deranged. He's clearly trying to put Paul off,
Well,
and
that late '70s, early '80s Pete Townsend, without making light of it, he
yeah,
did have, after the death of Keith Moon, certain issues of refreshment, and he had his moments. But still, in 1985 at Live Aid, he starts tickling Paul while he's trying to sing "Let It Be," which is kind of unconscionable, really.
you'd have done the same in front of an audience of billions. You'd have snuck up behind Paul and tickled him, wouldn't you?
Well, you know the story of Pete Townsend, where A.B. Hoffman gets on stage at Woodstock and he just
Yes,
he whacks or kicks him off the stage and smashes his head with a guitar and
yeah.
just goes into a tirade. But, heaven forbid, we're not here to criticize Pete Townsend, or are we?
Or are we?
But this is the end of Wings. So Wings go out as the Rochestra, and you can watch the Rochester-umentary online if you want about the whole escapade. But it is a pity that Campuchia has kind of been lost in the midst of time. It's a fascinating little time capsule of this kind of post-punk rock god kind of era.
It
Uh,
is. It's a sort of passing of the torch, I suppose. No one would have thought of it in those terms, but you can kind of see it as a bit of a watershed.
And with that, the 70s come to an end. And, again, we're in a very different place to where we were. You look back at the start of the 70s, they're all trying to figure out their place in a post Beatles universe. And by the end of the 70s, a lot of it has been decided. They are still frighteningly young. They're all in their 30s.
That's nuts that they're it's nuts that they're still that they're still in their late 30s.
Yeah, so
And
they're 36 to 39 years of age. Paul's 37.
yeah, and it's the other interesting aspect of this is that if you were putting money on where each of them would be, if you were looking at 1970, 71, George was out ahead, Ringo was dominating the charts, Paul was struggling a bit, and all of that has kind of pivoted, and the other three are almost sort of in semi-retirement by this point.
Yeah.
John is completely withdrawn. Ringo is still putting material out there, but his heart isn't in it. And George too is just not. He's focusing on other things. So
Yeah, but
Paul's drive and ambition is taking him forward, and fair
and
play.
and you know what, as we put this out in Christmas 2020, you can still see some of that quite very very largely at play still.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but there we go. The Beatles at Christmas in the 70s. 10 little snapshots that tell a really interesting story. What do you remember, folks? Do you remember watching any of that stuff on the BBC, particularly in 1979? Which records did you get in your stockings or under the tree during that decade? What do you all think? Why don't you get in touch with us and let us know? We are available in all the usual places at BeatlesPod on Twitter. Go search for the Nothing Is Real Facebook group, and Stephen's in control of that. He'll let you in. And, we are very grateful for all the downloads, wherever you get your podcasts, and any review that you leave. Well, the good ones in particular, but any review you leave, we're very, very happy. And thank you for all the nice things that you've been saying throughout the year. But that is it. The Beatles at Christmas. It tells a story. For Nothing Is Real, my name is Jason Carty.
My name's Stephen Cockcroft.
And we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening. Nothing Is Real is powered by Acast.